Welcome back to the Business of Christian Fiction. I'm your host, Rachel Fehrenbach, and today's episode is going to be slightly different than normal. In this episode, I hope to talk a little bit about where the podcast has been, what God has been doing in my own personal life, and also where I see us putting next. So let's get to it. When I first started this podcast way back in September of 2022, I had a simple goal. I wanted to make a space for conversation about creating fiction that could create an income and an impact. So much of the conversation I was hearing either landed in one camp or the other. If it was about impact, it often dismissed the need to do hard work. There was this idea, well, if God wants to do something with my novel, they'll make the doors open. And then there was the other camp that wanted to emphasize income, and it almost became a striving, hustling kind of encouragement. I knew I wanted to create a space that would talk about both and also talk about it from the fact that we don't need to strive or hustle our way, that we can create meaningful work that provides for our families without burning out, without hustling, without striving. And the heart of that has not changed. I still firmly believe that God can use our creative work to serve others, bring Him glory, while also still providing for ourselves, our families, and for future work. But over the years, I noticed something. The episodes that seemed to resonate the most with you, my listeners, were the episodes that not necessarily where we went really tactical, not necessarily the episodes where we went into marketing strategy or business systems or publishing decisions. While those were often the topics, it was when we zoomed out a little bigger and started asking some deeper questions. Questions like, how do we build without burning out? What does it really mean to cultivate a calling without striving? What does it mean to steward this life? What does it mean to steward a calling when your life already feels so full? Those were the questions that you guys were sending me DMs about. Those were the conversations that resonated with you the most. The questions that really got to the heart of what it means to be a Christian creative in today's environment. In 2024, my friend Erin Gurnell and I decided to do a micro series of sorts. We called it Creating from Rest. She had felt like the Lord had asked her to take a Sabbath from her creative work, and I felt like it was supposed to be a year to scale. And so we decided to hold one another accountable and to come together once a month and have a conversation about the lessons we were learning as we tried to do this thing with God. We realized quickly that while she was stopping from her work and I was trying to scale my work, we were really wrestling with the same question. How do we do this creative work from a place of dependency on God instead of striving? I didn't realize it at the time when Erin and I first discussed the idea of having these monthly conversations, that these conversations would become such a defining time in my creative journey. I didn't realize how significant the conversations would be. And I think they were significant because it really allowed, they're very raw, they're kind of long, but they were just very honest conversations between two friends about what it meant to have creative lives that we were stewarding and trying to steward really well. And we talk really honestly about the different lessons that God taught us that year. And it was in that year that God started to really shape me for where He's brought me to today. Now, the concepts of rest and Sabbath are not new to me. I've been practicing a 24-hour rest in my week for the last 7 years. I even recorded a podcast on it called Simply Sabbath, and you can find those episodes at simplysabbath.com. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to rest with God? And it has been such a life-changing practice, resting with Him each week. What I was not expecting as I started resting with God would be that I'd become face-to-face with what does it mean to work with Him. Because when you rest with God and you set aside time each week, you begin to have to reckon with how the other 6 days of the week are going. And it's a really interesting a really interesting aspect of Sabbath that I was not expecting when I first started practicing it. And I think that's what Aaron and I really started to explore in the conversations that we had over the course of the year of 2024. What I find interesting is that in that year, I encountered some challenges. We had a miscarriage. There was some other stuff that went on in that year. And the challenges haven't stopped. But what I learned in 2024 is that life is going to come at you. And the question becomes, how can I depend on God and continue working with Him, even when the challenges of life show up? Where is the balance between pushing and continuing to work through things, and when is it wise to take a step back? And how do we invite God into those decisions, and how do we lean on Him for that wisdom? That was what 2024 taught me. 2025 taught me that I needed to make more space, even more space, and make some really intentional decisions in order to steward not just my work, but my life well. So I started asking myself, what does it look like to steward this creative calling well? What does it look like to steward my entire life well? What does it look like to both rest with God, but also work with God, not just for Him, but with Him, in dependence and trust and obedience? The episodes that I created for the business of Christian fiction often brought those questions into play. These were the episodes that you were resonating with, sending me DMs, emailing me about. And I started to realize that I was not the only Christian creative woman out there who needed to be reminded that God had given me a creative calling to steward. But more than that, He gave me a whole life to steward. And that was one piece of it. But He also needed to remind me that my life was not fragmented. And it was not something that I had to juggle different pieces of, but rather something that I needed to treat as a whole and steward wisely. And I realized that other Christian creative women need to hear this too. And I am so appreciative to every man that listens to this podcast. But I noticed that women in particular have a really hard time, one, feeling like that they have permission to create. Between all the different things that they're carrying, all the different responsibilities, and between motherhood and jobs and homemaking and house management and volunteering at church and being a good friend and being a good sister and all the different things, a good wife. Between all those different roles, they often feel the weight of everybody else's needs, and they feel like it's selfish to create. It's selfish to give time to it, especially because it doesn't seem to have a significant ROI, a significant return on investment. And I think that's one of the reasons why I started the Business of Christian Fiction podcast to begin with, because I wanted to show these women that they could have a return on investment. There could be an income made from it if they were wise about how they stewarded it, how in the choices that they made, in the decisions that they made. But I realized that was just the tip of the iceberg. This went down so much deeper. In order to make those decisions about publishing, in order to make those decisions about even sitting down and writing the novel in the first place, you first have to be willing to say, I have permission to create, and not just permission, but a divinely given purpose to create. And my life can look differently than the world says it does, because the God of the universe has given me a different purpose than the world would ascribe to me. And they also need permission to say that the life that they are stewarding does not have to be in competition with the creative calling that they've been given, because the creative calling is one part of the life that they've been given to steward. And it's really hard sometimes when you have the weight of the world on your shoulders to not feel selfish when you say, I need time to pursue this calling, especially when you don't know what the outcome of that is going to look like. It's also hard to steward that when you know that the world or even our churches are saying these are the most important things. And if you're not doing that, then you aren't pursuing the most noble things. It's also hard when you know it feels like such a life-giving practice to create, and you know you need, but you also know what everybody else needs from you, and it's hard to give yourself permission to do that. I know that so many Christian women out there, they want to pursue the creative calling that God has given them. They want to create because it is like embedded in their DNA. I remember being in a Bible study. I was early on in my motherhood journey, had littles at home. And I was able to get away for once a week to do this Bible study. And I remember sitting at the table and saying to the other women sitting around it, that I felt like God had placed a creative calling on my life, that I was meant to write these novels that He had given to me back when I was late teens, early college, and early adulthood. These novels that were so alive in my soul, and I knew I was meant to write them down, these stories. And I shared this with them, and I said, I just don't know how to do that with being a mother. Like of little, like they take up so much time, I'm so exhausted, all this stuff. And I looked at them for wisdom, and they said to me, maybe you need to pray and ask God to help you be content with your season that you're in. And it hit me so hard. I took it to heart. I did pray. I asked God to help me be content. And I threw myself into all the things that I was supposed to do. Mothering really well, volunteering at my church, growing in relationships with others. And it wasn't until a few years later that another person who was also creative, he looked at me and said, Rachel, you were designed to create. You are creative. Why aren't you creating? And so I went back home to my husband and I was like, you know what? I think he's right. And I think we need to make time for me to create. It took him saying that to me for me to feel like I had permission to say this is something that I needed. And that is why we are expanding the scope of this podcast. Because I know that there are more women out there who have stories to tell, songs to sing, paintings to paint, whatever your creative outlet is, whatever creativity, whatever creative calling God has placed on your life. I know that you are out there waiting for somebody to give you permission, and I want this to be that for you. But not just that, not just permission, but a reminder why you do it in the first place. You do it because God had asked you to do it. You do it because you're divinely given purpose. You do it because it is an act of obedience. And I don't want to just give you the theoretical. I want to give you some practical advice, because I know way back when I finally went to my husband and said, okay, this is what I think we need to do. I think I need to go write once a week. I think it'll be good for me. And then later on when I said, okay, I think I want to pursue getting published. How are we going to make this happen? There was a lot of trial and error, not a whole lot of good advice out there. And it felt very much like I was striving most of the time, very much like I was hustling a lot. And it has been in the last few years that God has given me a much more holistic, much more rounded and settled in peace way of doing things. So that's why we're shifting from talking about just the business of Christian fiction to the bigger conversation about what it means to create from rest. And that will be the new podcast name. There will be a little bit of rebranding. If you are listening on podcasts, you won't need to do anything. It will still show up in your podcast feed. On YouTube, you might need to shift to a different channel. I'm not quite sure. Haven't worked out the details of that yet. But I will drop links in the show notes of this video if you're watching on YouTube. I'll also put the links in the show notes too of the podcast, just in case you're curious. But I want to stress that this is not a departure from what we've been talking about. We've been talking about creating from rest. We've been talking about stewardship. We've been talking about creating without striving for a while now. This is just giving it a little bit more formality. We're going deeper to the foundation of the things that we've talked about almost from the very beginning of this podcast. I've made a list of things that what it means to create from rest. It means to steward your life in alignment with God's design so that what you build flows from dependence rather than striving. It means you recognize that you are an embodied soul. Your home matters, your work matters, your relationship matters. And all of it unfolds within the limits of time and also within the limits of the capacity that God has given you. To create from rest means that you ask not just, what am I trying to build? But more than that, and probably more importantly than that, you ask, what has God entrusted to me? And how do I tend it faithfully? And so that's where we're headed. We're going to be talking about stewardship in the 4 different areas of our lives in body, home, field, and tables. We're going to talk about how to create without burnout. We're going to talk about how to make decisions with clarity, how to honor God-given limits. We're going to talk about how to partner with God in your creative work. And yes, we'll still talk about writing and publishing. That's my industry, so it's going to come up. That's where I live and breathe, and that's where my work is. And so the novels that I create and the books that I write, you're going to hear about that. That's kind of the practical way I'm living out this whole message of create from rest. And so, yeah, we'll still talk about some writing. We'll still talk about some publishing. So if you're a writer, you're not going to find this place less for you. If anything, it'll become more for you. But we will ultimately be looking at all of that through a whole life lens of stewardship. So if you came here because you're a writer, you're still in the right place. And if you're a creative woman who longs to make something meaningful and beautiful, but feel like your life is too full or you're too exhausted and you just don't know how to move forward, then this is the place for you too. I am incredibly grateful to every one of you who has listened to this podcast over the years. And I am so excited about what lies ahead because I 100% deeply, truly believe that God has designed you to create. Not from pressure, not from hustle, not from a place of striving, but from a life that is faithfully stewarded and deeply rooted in Him. Welcome to Create from Rest. I'll see you next time.